Right, so the game that I was working on, that my last project was Epic Mickey Power Up Illusion for the 3DS. So I'm like reading reviews for it. And then so this one guy says this, right? Pacing and difficulty both prove problematic throughout the game. And then I read another review, and the guy's like, one of the most elegant difficulty curves I've ever seen from the genre. So go figure. I figure if half the people complain my games are too hard and half of them complain they're too easy, then they're just right. Okay, so my name's Ara. Has anybody here listened to any of my talks before? Okay, cool. So I got a bunch of them. All right. Okay, so I'm a video game designer, as you may know. Say hi to Tim, everybody.
Hi, Tim.
You came in at just the right moment.
Good.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about depth in gameplay today. And first of all, thank you so much for coming out. This is like the most number of people I've ever had for a talk, so I'm super excited. Okay, so first, what do we mean by these words? So I was just curious. So I was like, is gameplay in the dictionary? So I looked it up, and gameplay actually is in the dictionary. And the dictionary isn't always the best place to talk about definitions for things, but just for fun, right? I looked it up, and Collins, the English dictionary, says this: plot of a computer or video game or the way that it's played. Does anybody think that sounds kind of weird? So I was like, maybe we should do, oh, by the way, also I neglected to say, I would really like to do this in a very conversational way, so if any of you guys have something to say or a question, like please like raise your hand or just blurt it out or whatever. Like, I don't want this to just be me like talking at all of you, right? So let's try to have a conversation. So, what's weird about this?
Why?
It's two different things.
Yeah, like what two different things? Yeah, exactly. So like, why don't we do that?
Very descriptive.
All right, this mouse is going to get out of control if I'm not careful. Yeah, so here's what I think is a better definition, and you guys tell me if you agree, right? Any player action within a game that affects its outcome, right? So, like watching a cutscene, that will not be gameplay. That makes sense. But under this definition, right, selecting menu items wouldn't be gameplay unless it actually affects the result of the game, right? So if you're jockeying around an options menu, it's probably not gameplay. But if you're jockeying around a menu that actually does something in the game, that sounds like gameplay to me. So what do we mean then when we say gameplay depth? Anyone want to take a stab at this? No wrong answers. Well, they're wrong, but Aaron,
could it be like you learn something early on, and then then what you learned gets applied in different ways, in more complicated, nuanced ways as the game goes on?
Okay, sure. Anything else? You.
How compelling or immersive the gameplay is.
Okay. How about you?
The number of options available to the player.
Okay. That's interesting. We'll cover that.
The experience continues to be expanded upon while playing, and it changes consistently working stability.
Okay, that's interesting. Bradley.
I think of it as being like, just use chess as an example, where you can become overwhelmed by the possibilities that are presented to you, and they're not, the interesting interactions that could take place are more than you could like think of at one time.
Maybe then it's deeper than you can handle.
Yeah.
Right? How about you in the back?
Just the complications and mechanics, how those mechanics work well with the other games.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. Okay, one more.
The extent of the consequences.
Interesting. What do you mean by that?
Basically, if I do one thing, what are all things that are going to happen as a result of this one thing?
So you mean like if there's more possible consequences than there's
And
more
the
depth?
far-reaching consequences.
Sure, sure. Yeah, so those are all good. Here's a couple other things I've heard some people say in articles and comments and stuff. This guy, Lewis Publisher, said depth apparently has something to do with the complexity of decision making. That sounds reasonable. This other guy, Timon Sylvester, is also in the industry, said a deep game creates meaningful, mechanics-driven play at high skill levels, kind of like what you guys said. Right? So that sounds reasonable, right? So the working definition I would like to use is gameplay depth is a concept of how much expertise can be gained in the way one plays a game. Does that sound reasonable to you all? You seem unsure.
It's a different thing to pin down as a concept.
Sure.
That was very personal.
It's personal?
It would vary person to person. I mean, one person plays, say, an MMO for a day, and they're like, oh, that's cute, it's just a game. Somebody else plays it and goes, I have an entire community and friends and an online family that is experiencing the same thing with me. I think it just, the meaning can vary person to person, how they're not just experiencing the game, but how they apply those experiences in-game and out of the game.
So it's interesting you say that. There's something else we'll come back to that's very, very related to that. Yeah.
I like it because of the operative word "can."
Yeah.
Like, you can still play a game, like, because it says, you can still play the game one way, sort of deal, but there is this level of complexity to it. So, like, even if you approach a game in a way that you don't explore the depth, it doesn't mean that there's not depth there.
Right. And it's interesting you brought that up, because I'll talk about that in a second, too. Yeah.
I don't like that expertise is on there because someone
Okay.
can play a game and not get better at it.
Right, but is the depth of the game dependent on your ability
I mean,
to...
it can be. That's why I said that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so when I'm talking about gameplay depth, like I'm kind of talking about something that's like, that exists as part of the game that's kind of invariant of your experience of it. Does that make sense? So if you guys can just humor me, let's use this as the operative definition for what we mean by depth. And we mean gameplay depth as in like, it's depth in the activity that you're doing. It's not necessarily like, games can be a lot of different things, right? I like to say that like a game can be kind of like a container of all other media. But what we're talking about tonight is gameplay as in like the activity of the gameplay, not just necessarily the 18 other myriad things a game can be. Does that make sense? Okay. So, I'd like to get my mouse under control. Here's some interesting things I want to point out to you guys about depth, and it's going to hit on a few of the things that you guys said, right? So, lots of choice does actually not necessarily result in depth. This is a screenshot of God of War, right? There's Kratos. He kind of doesn't look like Kratos, but so this is interesting, right? Because God of War is actually kind of infamous for giving the player lots and lots of different ways to attack the enemies. And in a lot of cases, it doesn't really matter what attack you use, right? You can just use whatever attack and kill all the enemies and it's all fine, right? So choices don't necessarily give you more depth. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, you can narrow that down to just choices that are bad one way or good the other, that, the outcome changes according to your choice.
Right. It's the choices that are actually meaningful to the outcome of the game that we care about. If we have different choices that result in that, then we get more depth out of them, right? But just giving you more ways to do things, strictly speaking, doesn't necessarily give you more depth. Here's something else that's interesting. You don't need a lot of rules to create depth. This is a picture of two dogs playing Go. Probably not really playing. There's probably some food right here. Has anybody played Go here? Okay, there's a lot of you. Okay, this is pretty good. So Go is really interesting. If you haven't played it and you have any interest in game design, I highly recommend that you at least spend some time studying it, because the beautiful thing about Go is that there's like very, very few number of rules. You can count them on one hand. There's like really like 3 or 4 or 5. And out of those rules, you just get this incredibly subtle, incredibly deep kind of game where, people dedicate their lives to it, It's virtually a martial art. So you can get lots of depth out of a few rules. And Go is one example how you can do that. Something else that's interesting is that accessible gameplay doesn't necessarily prohibit depth. Here's one example. Here's the latest Soul Calibur game. Right? So here's the interesting thing about Soul Calibur, possibly one of the best things about it, I think, is that Soul Calibur, for what I like to call a naive player, right? And by naive, I don't mean like that person's naive in life in general, but just like naive to the game, like a first-time player to the game. You can get a lot of really satisfying output without knowing what you're doing. You can just mash on your buttons, and the character looks like, you know, he's an expert if you didn't know any better. And so for people who don't know how to play at all, right, they can experience some kind of satisfaction. But at the same time, I mean, this is a deep competitive game. People play this competitively. So there's depth there, but then there's a layer there that's very accessible too. And it doesn't hamper, at least the way they do it in that game, right? And we'll get into this a little bit later. It doesn't hamper the depth at all. Does that make sense?
You're talking a little about like metagaming and stuff?
Well, it depends on what you mean by metagaming. But basically what I mean is that, well, I'm not sure what you're referring to actually.
Just like well, I mean, in Soul Calibur, you can be an expert to know how to read your opponent and what moves are the best to take on a certain character.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get to that, right? The experts play at a completely different kind of like layer of interaction, and we'll talk about that, right? So here's another thing. There also exists different kinds of gameplay depth, right? And I want to give you guys 2 examples. So one of them, that's over here. So you can kind of think of like games that are like tactics games like this, and even Go and chess and stuff like that, right? There's a kind of depth there. It's kind of like a strategic depth, right? There's a complexity of trade-off that you have to make at every single point in time that you have to make a decision, right? And that's depth in one sense, right? But there can be other senses of depth too. This is a really complicated diagram that I'm not going to explain the whole thing because it would take too long, but I'll just tell you enough that you guys get the gist of it. There can be also be a sense of depth in terms of like performance. And what this is actually, the example I want to give for this is like in racing games like Gran Turismo, and this is actually from actual real life racing, right? Like in the real world. This is, let me try to explain succinctly what this represents. Okay, basically this is like, you know when you're driving and you're turning, right? At some point, like when you're turning, when you turn too much, like your car breaks loose, right? You lose traction. That's like this right here, right? And then this is like, basically this line represents as you're trying to steer harder and harder out of a turn, right? Or into a turn or whatever, right? You're basically going along this line, right? And if you go too far, then you break traction, right? The crazy thing about like racing and why racing is really, really deep in video games and in real life, some video games, is that when you're about to break traction, right? When you're on the edge of that envelope, you actually get a little, this bump here, you actually get a little more traction than you ever would at any other point in time. And so the players who are really, really good, and racers who are really, really good, they kind of like operate in this extremely precise performance envelope. That's what these boxes represent, right? Like this big one is like, this is the envelope that like a pretty good race car driver operates at, right? And then like this little one is like, you know, if you follow racing, like this is like Michael Schumacher, right? And so, this is still depth, right? But it's a totally different kind of depth. It's like, I would say this is kind of also like the same thing like in Rock Band, right? Like I think Rock Band has depth, right? But it's not the same kind of depth. It's the depth of being able to operate in this kind of like envelope of performance that is much more sensitive than most people, right? And it's under like a very, very like increasingly smaller and smaller time constraints. Okay, so the next thing, and I want to talk about this go into this a little deeply. The perception of depth is all that matters to the player. This is leading to a little bit what you were saying. So let's talk about fighting games for an example. So if you're a naive player, right, naive in the sense that like Mortal Kombat's new to you and you've never seen it, or if You're Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman, who tours the country and tells people that video games are killing simulators. This is all you see when you see Mortal Kombat. Now, it's kind of hard to tell what's going on here. There's just a lot of blood and gore, and that's about it, really. Here's my point, right? When you first see a game and you're not familiar with how it works, and Mortal Kombat's a really good example just because its visuals are so striking, all you see, all the game is about is that which you can see, right? That which you can immediately apprehend, which is, right, body parts flying, gore, it's disgusting, who would want to play this, you know, children, parents screaming, all this stuff, right? But experienced players, they see fighting games more like in this way, right? I couldn't find a corresponding picture for Mortal Kombat for these, but basically, like, this is Street Fighter, this is Skullgirls, and this has the debug graphics drawn over it, right? And if you guys aren't familiar with what I'm showing here, these are basically the debug graphics of the collision of what's happening under the hood when you're playing, right? And so, like, these red boxes are what's sometimes called hurt boxes, and these green boxes are what's sometimes called hit boxes, right? So, like, when Sagat's red box overlaps Adon's green box, then Adon gets hurt, right? This is what the game's actually doing under the hood, right? Now, I'm not saying that, like, people who are expert actually, like, are visualizing these green boxes like the Matrix, right? But what I'm saying is that the level that they're playing on is on this level of interaction. They don't care what it looks like. You know, the first time that you played whichever Street Fighter Alpha this is, you know, maybe you were like, oh, wow, look at the cool graphics in the background, and like, oh, look at that badass mustache of Pluto. But after you played a whole bunch of times, it doesn't matter. You know, you don't care what it looks like. You don't care what Sagat looks like. You don't care about any of that, right? You just become engaged and interested in what's happening on the level of interaction, right? And so that is, the game actually becomes different, right? In the beginning, Mortal Kombat's about blood and guts and, oh, this is so extreme, right? And that's one game. But if you keep playing it more, the reason why you play kind of changes too, right? Doesn't it? You play because, not because of how it looks, right? You play because the actual interaction of the exchange that you're having with other players is interesting enough for you to keep going. So, here's another thing, right? So any depth in the game is only meaningful if it's actually accessible to you. Now this is, I can't believe I'm saying this is a really old game, but it's a really old game. Does anyone know what game this is? Yes, Toshinden. Okay, so here's a little story. Way back when Toshinden came out, right? Me and my friend, we were in college, and so we were playing, and my friend was using this character called Rongo, right? And notice how he has a club that's just about the size of your torso. Anyway, so I was playing against him, against Rongo, right? And Rongo had this one move where he swung his club, but it wasn't even like that special move. And you know, it's not like we were experts or anything, right? And my friend's always pissed off because I always beat him in video games, but in this game, he totally kicked my butt every time with this one stupid move, this Gigantum Mundus club, right? And I couldn't figure out what to do to beat his club, right? Every single match, it was like start, like boom, 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 game over, right? That's it. So the interesting thing was that for us, we couldn't see any more depth than that, right? That was all the depth we could see at the time. It was just me trying to do something with Rongo and him swinging his club and killing him. And so as far as we were concerned, right, there's no more depth to experience, right? We couldn't access it anything beyond that. But maybe the game does have depth, right? I'm hoping it has more depth than that. I'm assuming it probably does, right? But we just never discovered it. So for us, it may as well not have even have existed. The other thing that's interesting is that the perception of new depth is intrinsically motivated. Here's what I mean by that. So here's a screenshot of Spelunky. Who's played Spelunky? Okay, cool, lots of you. Okay, so Spelunky's got like a lot of subtle depth in it. And one of the things I'd like to use in this example is the, so first time you played, right, you notice when you're a beginner at the game, oh, sometimes when I fall I get hurt, right? And sometimes when I fall I don't get hurt. maybe the first couple times this happens to you, you're not sure why, right? Now, a lot of us, we've played video games, right? So we kind of know, like, oh, well, you know, usually if you get hurt from falling, it's because you fell too far, right? But this is actually like something that we've brought from our past experiences. So assume you don't even have that experience to rely on. What happens is the first couple times, like you get hurt when you're falling, you don't understand why, right? That happens a few times to you, you experience that, and maybe you notice this pattern. Oh, well, if I'm falling from somewhere that's really high, then I get hurt, but if it's not so high, then I don't get hurt, right? And once you reach the point that you make this realization about that part of the system of the game, this is very motivating, because what this does now is this increases your agency in the game. And what I mean by that is that you're armed with more information now that you can use to get farther than you thought you could previously, right? Once you understand this part of the system, then you're far less likely to get hurt from falling. Right? And there's even another slightly deeper layer of depth to that, which is, oh, you know, if you keep playing, you may notice, oh, well, actually, if I fall a distance of 8 tiles or greater, right, or whatever that number is, it's 8 or 9, then I'll get hurt. But if it's less than 8 tiles, then I won't get hurt, right? Okay, so conversely, the inability to perceive depth is intrinsically discouraging, right? Now going back to that Shirinian example I was talking about, right? Since we couldn't see any more depth, guess what we did? We stopped playing, right? Because it was like, oh, that's all the game is. Well, my friend didn't want to stop playing. He wanted to keep beating. Second point, right? So because we could not discover any more depth to be experienced in that game, we just stopped playing. There wasn't anything there left for us. So I think it's pretty reasonable to say, right? Generally, you want a game's depth to be as accessible as many people as you can, right? You'll get 2 good effects from doing that, right? One is that the better that a game can communicate its depth, the more people can apprehend that depth, right? And the more people that can apprehend that depth, the more people, you know, all other things being equal, will be playing great. You know, so that's good. But what I think is even more important, right, is that the more people that can apprehend new depth, the more people are actually learning something meaningful, right? Or at least in that game, right? Now, it's not something meaningful in terms of like it's going to help you like live your life better the next day, but I mean still, right? It's something significant that you're learning that you didn't know before, right? Games have this really special power to do this, that in a way that other media can't, right? And if you can learn something when you're playing a game that you didn't know before, I think that that's pretty significant. I think that that's more valuable personally than just getting entertainment value of it, or just, okay, well, I've killed 4 hours today, or the game said that, like, now my experience is 5,012 or whatever. So, there's 3 things that determine how much depth in any given game is going to be accessible to you as a player. One of them is your past experience. If any of you guys heard my talk last year, it's the word that I like to make up called cognitive baggage, which basically means all your past experiences of everything you know about games, you inexorably bring them to every new game that you play, whether you want to or not. So that will color, in good and bad ways, any new game that you experience. The other thing that determines how well you can access depth as a player is your current dexterity level. And by this, I not only mean your hand-eye coordination, right, but also your mental dexterity, your mental acuity. And also, the game's ability to communicate its depth to you. And I'm going to go back and show you that screenshot in a second, right? Number 3 is the only one that you can do anything about as a developer, right? Because you can't control, I mean, you can assume, right, but you can't control the player's dexterity, not directly anyway. You can't control what their past was, right? But you can control how the game presents itself, right? And this is super duper duper important. This is, I think people don't give this enough credit. Here's an example, right? So here's another screenshot of Spelunky. So, okay, let's look at like what's this over here? Okay, so for people who haven't played Spelunky, okay, what is this? Gold. Okay, what does gold do? Okay, so what's going to happen if you run into this? You know, pick it up, someone said nothing, what else? Okay. It's probably safe to say everyone expects to get gold, right? So like, how do you know that? How do you know that that's going to happen if you haven't tried it? Yeah, it's all that stuff, right? I mean, the game's symbology is basically telling you, like, look, this thing that looks this way, it looks this way because it does these kinds of things that are consistent, hopefully, with how it looks, right? Same thing with, like, you know, an enemy. Like, every single thing that a game depicts to you, right? It's communicating to you how it's going to work. And sometimes a game can do a better job of that, and a game can do a worse job of that. You know, games are like teachers, right? And so there can be better and worse teachers. And there can be games that are better at teaching you how they are and what their nature is. And there can be games that are worse at teaching you what their nature is. Right? So here's a bad example, right? I don't mean a bad example. I mean an example of a game that teaches you something important. Like here's a spike. Okay, now for people who don't know Spelunky, what do you expect that this spike will do? It will kill you when you touch it, right? If you fall above, it'll probably kill you, right? What if you like do this, like, what do you think this will do?
Bounce back.
Either hurt you or not do anything.
Why do you say that?
Because there's been games where you could walk into the side of things won't hurt you. So like there's others like, yeah, screw it, you touch it, you get hurt.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because that's how it works, actually. What I would say, at least the first time I read this, right, and I think a lot of you would have the same experience, is that the first time I saw this, I'm like, oh, look, okay, there's spikes, right? There's even spikes sticking up from the side. So everything about this is telling me this is Danger Zone 2000 from all directions, right? This is dangerous no matter what. But in reality, that's not how it works. In this game, right, as some of you guys know, you can walk in from the side and you'll just like walk on top of it. Like you'll be in front of it. Totally safe, right? Here's the crazy thing is that this thing, like this symbology, so clearly communicates that it's dangerous from the side that unless it's just like a fluke or you're just farting around or something, or maybe you played a game like the one that you said, right, where in your experience sometimes you can do that, right? I actually never played a game that happens in until this one, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, hold on one second, and then I'll do it. So for me, right, it was like I would never ever try to even experiment from coming in from the side because everything about this so unequivocally communicates it's dangerous from the side, but it isn't. Yeah.
And there's ways you can make up for things like that. You're right, though, that is bad. But then you have points in games where you try to teach someone something through, like, they have to walk through those spikes in a hallway where it's the only way you can go to advance in the game. Or you have to walk down a hallway that there's gold in so that you see that you can pick up the gold.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, right? So actually, like me and one of my friends, we were just discussing, like, how would they have taught you this better, right? Assuming that they didn't change in symbology, right? And one way would be like, yeah, they put you in a situation in the beginning where you have no choice but to walk into it from the side, and then you see how it works.
Or they show you like a computer do it.
Or that, right? That's probably even clearer, right? Because even if they made you do this in this game, right? It's kind of like, it's kind of sketchy, yeah, because you're going to be instantly targeted, you're like, I'm going to die. But you don't die. Yeah, in the back.
I was going to ask about that, like that specific problem of like teaching people, because I know that the game's procedurally generated, right? Or at least
Yes.
randomized.
Yes.
And something that I was wondering about is like I hear a lot of like quote unquote hardcore gamers, and by hardcore gamers I mean the internet hardcore, you know,
Sure.
hardcore kids
Yeah.
complain like whenever something is made even remotely accessible. So
Right.
I was thinking like if you were to do that, like what about the group of people who would complain, oh you're making it too easy for the people who didn't jump into the spikes like I did, like a hazing ritual of some sort.
Yeah, so it's really interesting that you bring that up, you know. I'm glad you did though, because I kind of find that people like to talk about difficulty as if it's like something on like this like one-dimensional line, right? Like, oh, it's hard, and then it was hard, and that's it. We're not going to say anything more about it. And, oh, it was easy, and it was easy, and there's nothing else to say, right? But that's very like intellectually dishonest, actually, right? Because when something's hard, especially in the media, right, I find that like nobody really talks about like why is it hard. And that's really, really important, right? Because it's like it could be hard for several reasons that change the character of what the issue is completely. Like, it can be hard because you know what to do and you know what the situation is, you just don't have the dexterity to surmount it, whatever that challenge is, right? Or it could be hard because you're confused and you have no idea what's going on, right? Which is a completely different situation. Or it can be confused because, you know, the game has actually communicated something misleading to you, right? And the question is, right, it's like, you know, where do we want to have difficulty in our games? You know, like, I think a lot of us value challenge in games, but is that the same as like a game like challenging you at every turn for no reason, right? I kind of am of the mind that, you know, things like the basic rules of how the game should work, right? I don't think that there should be, I don't think you should put the player through any kind of like special trouble to get to that point, right? I think that the basic rules of the game and what the goals are and how the game works and things like that, there's just no excuse not to clearly communicate those things, you know? Some people kind of have a hard-on for like games to be just ridiculously hard for no reason, like in every single way, right? Like Dark Souls, yeah. And so like it's kind of ironic. I had this quote from Dark Souls, the producer, Miyazaki, I forgot his first name, but you know, he kind of had a quote about basically like how you know, if like trouble or difficulty to the player like isn't actually related to something meaningful in the game, then there's no point to it, right? But then in Dark Souls, I think there's a lot of things where they just screw with you for no good reason, right? And so I think that's a little excessive. Okay, so we can come back to some of that stuff. So here's a really interesting thing, right? The game's depth is the most challenging aspect of it, of the game to develop. And it's also the least salient aspect for players. Right? And I'll explain to you what I mean by that. Does everybody know what I mean by salient, though?
No.
I'll say like obvious, right? It's just a more fancy word for something being obvious. It's the least obvious aspect of the game is its depth.
It's like a relationship. You're not going to start a relationship, or you're not going to be attracted to someone because of their personality. You're going to be attracted to them because how they look. And then later, when you find out they lost some personality, you're
Well,
going to
forgot. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's it. It's like a game. A game is going to attract you because it's beauty. So, like even a really hardcore gamer is going to see something like Mortal Kombat and be like, wow, that was amazing. And then they find out it has amazing gameplay too, and they're going to be hooked. Like, you can't have just one or the other.
Right, because you can't see the gameplay with screenshots, can you? Right. So yeah, I mean that's a good point, right? It kind of like attracts you with the surface stuff, and then you find out that you have a better reason to enjoy that.
Yeah. Also, it takes a while to find the depths of a game, I think, too. Sometimes.
It does. It does. Okay, so let me show you something. Let me show you guys something. Okay, so you can kind of like actually like order like all the different aspects of a game, you know, hierarchy of salience. Okay, this is what I got here, right? So on the left-hand side, I'm going to list various aspects of what a game can contain, what a game has. And on the right-hand side is like what that aspect demands on the player. And you'll notice that each of these things we go through, right, we're going to start with the most salient, the most obvious thing. And as we work our way down, right, it's going to become less salient. And also as we work our way down, each of these aspects are going to be more and more demanding for the player. So, like, what's the most obvious thing? Yes, graphics and stuff. So I'm glad you said that, right? And it's the most obvious thing because it's very undemanding for you, right? All a human needs to do to apprehend that thing is just to observe it, right? And then we got animation, and that's, you know, pretty obvious, pretty salient, pretty undemanding, but maybe a little bit more so than something static, right? Because now you have to observe it over time, right? Like, this reminds me of that, there's like one of those like sort of viral videos that goes around with all those like college basketball players, right? There's like a gorilla that's walking around in the back. Or it's a bear?
A dancing bear.
Dancing bear, right? Nobody notices the dancing bear, right? Because you have to watch the whole thing and pay attention to it. So text, for most people, unless you're like 3 years old, or unless we're talking about like really severe edge cases, right? So text is a little bit more demanding than those two, right? Because you have to read it, you have to comprehend it.
A lot of times people don't want to read.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing, right? And then a little bit deeper than that is what I'm calling avatar control rules. Now this is basically encapsulating everything that goes on like between like you, like the controller, and like what happens on the screen, right? So in other words, like what does your character do when you press the button, right? Well, that takes a little bit more demand on you now because you have to press the button on the controller, watch the screen, right? And then you have to learn that association. You know, okay, when I press this, that happens, right? The next little, slightly lower, deeper level, right, is what I'm calling gameplay rules for competent play. And this is basically like everything that goes on in the game, like in game world terms, right? So you have to basically learn, like this is the rules of the game, like in terms of the game world, as in like your character, your avatar in the game doing what it's doing in terms of game world words, right? Instead of like, you know, press A on the controller, right? It's like we're talking about like how it's going to interact with the game world and how like you're going to learn relationships between like how different things work in the game world. Does that make sense? And then finally, right, after all of these different layers, we get to something that I'm calling deep play. So this is the point where now you're actually playing at a level where you can form strategies and actually perform at a level that's a little bit better than just a competent play.
Hey,
right?
what would you consider exploits? Or,
Exploits, like what?
you know,
Like exploiting a game?
runs, whatever.
I think it has to be in deep play because, right? Because you don't know about.
But it's not a strategy the developer intended either.
Right, but I don't care whether the developer intended it or not.
Okay.
Right? So, I mean, that's a good question, right? But yeah, I mean, that would be all under here because really, like, this is everything under, like, you've learned how to play the basic game, right? So here's the funny thing. All these things, all these 6 guys here, right? Well, these first 3 are completely non-interactive aspects. And these last 3 are interactive aspects, right? So it's interesting because it's like, relatively speaking, right? I would say that like these kinds of things are easy to develop on. They're just inherently more accessible for players. And for developers, I think these last 3 aspects are hard, relatively speaking, once again. And they're just intrinsically less accessible, right? Because you have to, because they necessarily place a certain kind of demand on you. Now, another thing that's interesting is that, like, if you look at these different kinds of, like, you can call them media maybe, with respect to, like, how good are we, like, as, like, a society, as, like, humans in, like, making them, right? Like, we've been doing, like, this stuff for, like, 100 to thousands of years, right? Like, we collectively have, like, that much experience doing it. But we've been doing, like, this stuff for what, 30 years?
On the previous part, what did you say? What was the line you said that divided them? You described each section down there.
Yeah. Right? So another reason why these are just harder to address, right, is that we just don't understand them as well. Yeah, Tyler.
To take it out of the video game sense, though, wouldn't those bottom 3 also apply to sports?
Yeah.
Interactive games outside of videos?
They totally would. Yeah.
Skills of the craft or something.
So if you're saying the bottom 3 we've only been doing 30 years, I would argue the top 3 we've only been doing 30 years like video games as well.
No. What?
You think like graphics and animation and sound like?
I mean, if you're basically combining as the video games as the bottom 3 because we've been making games for many, many years. They're just not video games.
Right.
So we've been making gameplay rules and deep play for a very long time.
Have we though? Like at the rate that like I don't want to like get like too like mired in like the nitty gritty, but I mean it's a decent point.
Definitely, there's been art and at least art and sound longer than that though.
Yeah, it's not the most important thing. So I don't want to get.
Instead of time, look at the number of, right? So instead of thinking how long have we been making games and how long have we been making art, think of the amount of game makers versus the amount of devices.
That's a good way to put it. Anyway, it's not the most critical thing. Yeah, Aaron.
I was gonna say, like, the important thing is how much we've actually been thinking about it. Like the guys who made football or even like boxing back in the day, were they sitting down thinking, all right, we got to make these rules and all these different things? Were they looking at it in a macro sense?
Yeah, like I shouldn't like. I mean, yeah, sports have existed, but like people haven't been like devising games the way that we're doing now in that frequency. Anyone else want to make a comment?
This is your most controversial slide for sure.
Yeah. Interesting, isn't it? It's not a game until you get, well, here, really, right? Good point.
Questions just play.
You're going to say something about that in a second. Anyone else want to say something? Yeah.
This one isn't like an argument this time.
No, it even can be.
But in multiplayer games, like this seems very geared towards single player games. I'm wondering where like a social aspect would fall in, because I can think, in some cases it is interactive, but its level of depth varies heavily from game to game.
Yeah, that like makes it a lot more complicated, right? Because now we're not just talking about how the game is communicating itself to you. Now we're talking about how the game is enabling like other players to communicate to you, right? So yeah, it gets a little more hairy.
Well, it's almost as if we need another layer to this of emergent gameplay and metagame.
Okay, so like, what do you mean by that? And where would
Well,
you
after the game either on par with the deep play level or past the deep play level, just coming from like a hobby game side of that, Magic the Gathering, for example, at base form is a very simple mechanical game, but the strategies and the depth come from the social interaction, the meta strategies that come from each deck and the rules within each play style. And a distinct kind of meta kind of shows up and kind of informs the gameplay for a whole second of time of the game's existence at any given time.
Yeah, maybe so.
And
that's fair.
Things become emergent. Like, I mean, look at League of Legends, things like that of that nature. They just launched their season 3, and all of a sudden there's all this stuff happening that nobody ever expected, even in the beta testing, because players are able to kind of take down past the deep layer into this emergent layer, and kind of show new rules in the game that weren't even necessarily expected.
So that's interesting. Now, I don't necessarily think that whether gameplay is emergent or not would necessarily make it deeper or less deep, right? But it's definitely a valid point. Yeah.
Perhaps a better visual representation of this would be that for every game it's a little different, obviously, but it's kind of like a fluctuating pie chart in a sense. The number or the percentage amount changes depending on the type of game, whether it's an MMO or FPS, or if it's a card game or a board game.
Sure,
Stuff shifts around.
like some mobile games, maybe like this.
Yeah, and Angry Birds is pretty simple. I mean, it's a puzzle game, yes, but it's going to have a different sort of pie chart compared to World of Warcraft in terms of where those pieces fit, and how much of them are actually being applied with your even if you're just looking at it from the outside.
Absolutely. Tyler.
I have a question I'd like to pose based on that concept is, would you consider this something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like a pyramid where you need those bottom layers in order to grow to the next layers in that structure?
No, I think the answer is
What? Stopping the recording.
Because I was talking to David Kuntz the other day, right? And he had a really good point. He was like, well, if you're like a 3-year-old baby, right? Okay, now we're getting to the edge cases, okay? If you're a 3-year-old baby, then text might actually be like down here, because you can't read. Okay? But you can, you can kind of press buttons, and I think even 3-year-olds can notice that pressing buttons does something, right?
Is there a difference between observe and read in that context?
Fair enough. Yes, or if you don't speak English and you're playing an English game, or if you're, okay, well, we don't have to cover all of these. Yeah, but good point, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, don't be
But
sorry.
If you were to compare like video games to say like a decision tree, like, and is depth related to the total amount of nodes, or is it related to the total amount of end nodes? Like, if say the decision tree was progression shape, like, you know, say Mass Effect, where you start in the same place, you branch out like crazy, and then it all comes back to the same shitty conclusion.
I would say if it all comes back, right? And that depth is like a red herring. It's not really depth. It's like the thing. Like, did you ever play? I know like Final Fantasy VI did this. There's some Japanese RPGs where they'll like give you a choice, right? Like some characters talking to you. It's like, do you want to do this or that? And it's like you choose, and it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Like you pick one, you're like, oh, thank God I made the right choice. I can continue. Like, no, it doesn't matter. It's a fault choice.
That's actually kind of the reason I asked, just because you were talking about fighting games being very deep, but in the end they only have two end nodes. You know, either you win or you lose. And so I've always like sort of had issues with people saying like, oh, JRPGs have no depth because there's no consequence. I don't.
But here's the thing though, is that the difference is that in a fighting game, even though there's only two possible end states, right? Each individual action that you take is still going to affect how you reach that end state, right? It's going to have an effect on which end state you reach. That's the important thing, is if it has an effect or not. Whereas if you're playing some kind of narrative game and they give you a false choice, there's no depth there because it actually makes no difference which one you pick. It's not affecting anything.
Okay, yeah, that's the reason I asked, because I guess that puts it more on the number of like decision permutation nodes in the middle rather than at the end.
Yeah, and you know what, like I'd even turn it back on you, right? Like there's a lot of games, like action games in particular, right? They don't really have a clearly defined like game tree structure. Like how would you put a game tree on like a racing game, you know? Like how would you make that mapping? It doesn't really make sense at all, does it? Yeah.
But I guess the big thing is like for games, and I think for JRPGs, is that their focus of depth is somewhere different than like Western RPGs. Like Western is more like, you know, different choices lead to different outcomes, while JRPGs is more about like combat. Like your combat choices change the way that the combat flows in the game. So you could change so you get some areas you might be shallow, and in some areas you might be deep. I guess it's the development side where they want their game to be deep.
Yeah, and then the other thing that I'm not explaining at all, so in this talk that's totally outside the scope of this, is like, you know, there can be depth in other things other than the gameplay. You know, there can be narrative depth, right? And I'm not talking about those at all tonight. So yeah, like games can have so many different things that you can have so many different senses of depth.
I think maybe too much depth might be bad in all areas. Like in that scenario where you have two different spots where you can have depth in one or the other or both. Whereas it might be too much to ask the user to get really good at all these different things rather than say, oh, here's your mind-numbing time, and then here's your time where you're really thinking and getting.
Yeah. Well, here's the interesting thing. There's a couple more slides, and then like maybe we can talk about this a little more, right? But the thing I find really fascinating that I'm actually like not really sure what the answer to is that there can be, right? There's an implication that, you know, because depth is inherently inaccessible, right? In this kind of respect. What I mean by that is that like in order to experience like a certain amount of depth in gameplay, like you have to go through a certain number of things, right? And so it might be the case that like, yeah, like certain kinds of depth are just too much for, well, actually I have an example of that. Let's go through these last few, and then we'll see what happens, right? So, in terms of like accessibility and depth, there's three possible ways that you can deal with it, or not deal with it, okay? So I'm going to enumerate these, and yeah, this is going to be interesting, right? So approach number one, which you can kind of call it like the new school style, right? Like a lot of commercial games do this, right? They just want to basically make it easier on the player, right? I think like there's an XCOM demo that came out, right? You had like, I was like shocked. I don't know if the whole game's like this. Maybe someone will tell me, but I was like really shocked because you made like, there's actually no decisions for you to make in the demo at all. It was just like, okay, move the cursor here. Okay, move the cursor here and press this button. Okay, move the cursor here. Okay, demo's over.
No, the game is not like that.
No, okay. I was very disappointed by the demo was though. So yeah, so like they just focus on removing barriers for players, really, at like the cost of everything else, right? And here's the really interesting thing is that sometimes this results in this kind of like, what I think is like really weird statistical tuning that doesn't really adequately address underlying design problems. Anybody played a game called Renegade Ops? Okay, one person. Okay, cool. Or actually, I think that the Legos, like Star Wars or Lego whatever games, have this problem too, where like there's a lot of action happening on the screen. There's a lot of like attacks that are coming at you, but it doesn't really matter that much whether you dodge them or not, because they give you like, they're so liberal with the amount of health they give you, right? And like Renegade Ops is basically like this top-down shooter where you drive around and you shoot things and you dodge things, right? But they give you so much health that it's like any single like thing that you're supposed to dodge is now less meaningful, because in most cases you just don't have to dodge it. I'll just take the hit and collect another health later, right? Yeah, Tyler.
You're 50.
Okay. Right, and this is like relatively easy to do, which is I think why everybody does this, right? It's like, okay, just find out like where like people are dying at your games and just like remove the options, right? And you know, this reduces the barrier to entry, right? But I think that this also, like what ends up happening is that you're usually sacrificing depth at the same time when you do this, right? And you get a game that everyone can play, but it's not really giving a meaningful experience for everybody who does, right? So approach number 2 is what my friend likes to call dealwithit.com, or the old school style, right? Which is basically the exact opposite of what I described, right? This is like the land of Dark Souls, okay? Right? So this is like where you focus on the depth of the game and the dynamics you want to get out of it, and you don't really pay attention to much else, right? So it's more work than doing the first approach, I think, to just make it accessible at the cost of everything else, right? But it's easier than the third one that I'm about to explain, right? And if you do things this way, like you can ensure that your depth isn't compromised, right? The dynamics of the game that you want are compromised, but you're compromising accessibility, right? So Dark Souls I mentioned, like Vagrant Story. I don't know if you guys played that, but that was like incredibly deep game and very, very obtuse. Okay, so the third way, right, is kind of like it's like neither of those two extremes, right? There's depth in the game, but this is kind of like the Soul Calibur thing, right? So you have depth in your game, but you want to make it as accessible as possible. And so you focus on the ability of the game to communicate to the player, right? I mean, your game is a teaching device, so your game is teaching players, you know? And so things like, how players read things, right? And the kind of feedback that you give and when you give feedback and what it looks like and what that puts into the player's head and what they're thinking about and all these other things, like, these are all really important things that you can actually actively work to make a game more accessible without actually sacrificing its depth, right? And this is very hard, and this is very time consuming, and this is very resource consuming. And I think that's the reason why a lot of games don't do it, even though I think it results in the best kinds of games. But here's the last thing that I think is really, really interesting. Okay, second to last thing. Right, so if you make a game this way, right, then you truly approach the point where you can help the most number of players reach as far depth as they can get, right? You can't control your players' abilities innately, right? But if you can communicate to them better, then you can hopefully give them an experience where they can get deeper in the game than they would be able to otherwise, right? So Rock Band, I think, is another really, really good example of that, just because its range of difficulty is so wide, Soul Calibur is another one. Mario Kart? Is Mario Kart deep?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take your word.
Yes.
So here, okay, so this is the last point I have. And this is what I find really fascinating, right? And this is the thing that I'm like I'm not really too sure of. So some game dynamics, right, might actually be possible this way. Like for example, anybody played Steel Battalion? Yeah. Okay, so like Steel Battalion, if you don't know, like you're operating like this mech. Like I'm not just talking about like the sheer complexity of the controller, which is like has like 20 buttons on it and like 3 joysticks, right? But you're actually like moving, like you're moving something in space on like several different axes at once, which is a gameplay dynamic that like hardly any other game has, right? Which is like, first you get this little thing that you're moving with your thumb, so you're moving a reticle on the screen, right? At the same time, you've got a control where you can turn like this, right? Like your upper body can rotate independently of the torso. At the same time you're doing those two controls, right? Your torso can move around on the ground like independently of everything else, right? You're basically moving like 3 different dimensions of control totally independently, right? Which, I mean, it sounds daunting, right? It is. It's very taxing. It's very inaccessible, you know? Maybe there's a way to train a player up to that point that's more gentle, right? I mean, that game certainly doesn't do it, right? But like just to be able to like adequately, competently play in the game where you can do those things, right? And like you can actually participate in those dynamics. Like it's such a huge barrier of entry. Yeah.
Probably looking around in FTSs, there's like a less lower level example of that. Like people who never touch a game can't do that.
Yeah, there you go. Right, and there's different, like I'm picking the most extreme example, obviously. Yeah, it happens on different levels. And like the other thing I think is a similar example is like the Rock Band keyboard, right? Or Keyboard Mania, which is the game they copied from a long time ago.
Yeah.
Right? In order to play, like who's played the Rock Band keyboard? It's really hard, isn't it?
The pro version? Yeah.
It's
pretty.
Like even the non-pro version is pretty hard, right? Because it's like for you to even begin to start like enjoying that, you need to be able to like pick this one key out of like the 12 keys, like in an instant, which is like it's hard to do that, you know? Like it's. I mean, right? Like the barrier is so high just to start that it's like. So here's the funny thing, right? Like these. I think that those kinds of experiences, those kinds of dynamics are valuable, but they're like inherently inaccessible, right? Which means that like not everybody can enjoy them. Like I do certainly think that there are things in this world that are completely fulfilling and enjoyable and worth doing, but just like the barrier to entry is so high that like you just know that not a lot of people are going to do it, right? So, I mean, whether that's the way to go with whatever game you're making is up to you, right? Sometimes it's worth it to be more accessible. Sometimes maybe it's worth it to actually deliberately be less accessible. It's a choice you have to make. Yeah.
Something I was wondering for your opinion on, like, what do you think about choices that you make at the start of the game that will determine the difficulty of it? Like, not just like enemy health and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But for example, games like Devil May Cry, one of the things that you get is this counter ability. You can have the counter ability or this really sweet ability to teleport around the place.
Okay.
One of them is functionally better than the other.
Yeah.
But if you decide to take the functionally worse one, you're gonna have this really, really like complicated game. You're just trying to like time all these counters with all these different enemies.
Yeah. You make the game harder by taking that one.
Yeah.
Well, how does the player know that though?
There's at the very beginning of the
Do they know it's going to be harder though, just by picking one option?
I don't know if it says.
See, I would say that's bad gameplay design. You don't want to have a different experience based on some blind choice at the beginning of the game, or at least different difficulty, a different experience.
If it's a blind choice, then yeah, that's really bad, right? Because it's like, I mean, it's like picking what you start with in Dark Souls, right? It's like I have to play through the whole game in order to figure out which is the best choice at the beginning.
Just to be clear, are we talking about the different playstyles of Devil May Cry, like Royal Guard and all that?
Yeah.
Yeah, those just cater to different playstyles. One's like parry, other ones that allow for more combos. So if you're more of a defensive player, you're better off choosing Royal Guard. There's more advanced attacks that you can get off of that, but you kind of learn that as you play through the game.
And balance in games is like its own field. It's like they're trying to balance those things definitely, but it's like Oblivion. That's probably a better example of them trying to explain something. Is you pick a billion skills in the beginning and what you're going to focus on for the rest of the game, but they try to explain it the best that they can.
Well, that system is especially jacked.
Yeah.
Like, I don't even want to get into that. I'm not getting into that.
When you're halfway through the game, you're like, bad choice.
Like, yeah, for Oblivion, even, like, they had, like, these major skills and their minor skills, but, like, the way that they worked, it was, like, completely counterintuitive.
Oh, no, it was bad. In fact, I remember reading that the best way to play the game was to not build on your major skills.
Yeah, exactly.
To start the game by picking the things you did the least as your major skills to stop enemies from getting too hard and stuff like that.
It's like the optimal choices are exactly the opposite of what you would expect based on what they need.
Well, I sort of wanted to know what you thought about, like, because you mentioned agency earlier on in the talk, and like, so when you think about Spelunky versus Braid, like both games are really great and both have been attributed as being deep.
Sure.
But I would say Spelunky has a lot more agency than Braid does, because Braid is a very constrained linear experience.
Well, to be clear, like the sense that I was talking about agency in was just in the sense of that, like, when you learn something, regardless of what game that is, when you learn something about how a game works that you didn't know before, that increases your agency in the game. So now you're like, oh, I know how this works. Now next time that I try playing the game, I'm not going to lose because of that thing, because I understand something about it better.
Okay, well I guess I mean then more in terms of the ability to alter the way that the game flows and progresses using the mechanics that are available. Like Braid has essentially one path for all puzzles that to be solved. I mean there's a couple of variations, but like I was wondering what you think of like the difference between that kind of looser, broader experience that you can select versus a more linear one. If there's anything that you wanted to say about that?
I mean, it's just a different paradigm, I guess. It's just a different way of playing, you know? I mean, some of my friends know I don't like puzzle games.
Right.
So, but